output could potentially be sold, and how many workers could potentially be employed? Is there any fixed limit?
There's no limits.
No, there is no limit. It depends on how much output we can produce and how many people there are able and willing to work. And if the wage and price level can adjust to the available quantity of money and the volume of spending that quantity of money will support.
Wouldn't the only caveat to that statement be the particular product they were producing may have certain limitations as to the demand, so labor might have to shift to a different area of production?
Oh, yeah, but notice the proposition refers to aggregate real demand, economy-wide real demand. Now, there are some products, the best illustration perhaps is table salt. Table salt is a case, I think, where people have long been sated. No one is waiting for the price of table salt to fall before he salts his steak more heavily. So we could assume that if labor became more productive in the making of table salt, we wouldn't want any more. Maybe there are alternative uses for table salt. Then we might want more, but we wouldn't want more to salt our food. And if that were the only use for it, then as we could produce the same quantity of table salt with less and less labor, what would happen to the number of workers employed in table salt? They'd be going down. But are there any things that we would like more of? Is everything in the position of table salt? Most things? No. So to the extent that we could produce table salt or anything in its position with less labor, we'd have more labor available to produce more of other things, which we certainly do want. And there's a ready and waiting outlet for other things, things that people would like to have but previously could not afford. So just think of all of the things we'd like to have but can't afford. Well, what do we need to be able to afford them? Pardon me? Okay, now you say more money. If you alone...
Lower price, more real money.
More real money. You see, any one individual, it would be reasonable for any one individual, if he has more money, well, that's the road to him getting more goods, certainly. But if we had the same production, and if there's the same total supply available, and one individual is spending more money, what is implied about the goods and services remaining to others? That would be that much less. And if we had the same output being produced and sold, but more money is spent to buy it, what's the effect on prices? There would be higher prices. Now, you see, many people have believed that the key to getting more goods is just getting more money. But if that were true, there'd be no reason for any country anywhere in the world to be poor. All they would need is one printing press, create more of their money, and then they would presumably have prosperity. Well, what is the actual effect of mere money creation without any corresponding increase in the production and supply of goods? Then you have rising prices. If you think in terms of our price level formula, the price level equals the aggregate monetary demand divided by the supply. If we double the quantity of money and volume of spending while the supply remains the same, what happens to prices? If we double the spending to buy the same quantity of goods, what would happen to prices?
Go up.
They would go up how much? They would double. Well, now, if there's twice the expenditure and you have to pay twice the prices, would such an increased monetary demand represent an increased real demand? No, it would not. There would not be any additional real demand accompanying merely an increase in monetary demand. And this is a point I wanted to make very soon. So let's jump there, since that's where we are. This is point 7. Particularly subpoint A under 7. More monetary demand without more supply just means higher prices, and thus no additional real demand. More monetary demand by itself is not sufficient to create more real demand. If all we have is more monetary demand, we'll just have higher prices, and the larger expenditure will not buy any more than the smaller expenditure. So more money is really not the fundamental answer to more real demand. It's fallacious at the level of the economy as a whole. What does it take so that when there is more money in spending, for prices not to go up as much as the volume of spending, with the result that the larger spending becomes enabled to buy more than the smaller spending did? They have to have more production. To take the simplest case, what would be required so that double the money and double the spending would succeed in becoming a doubled real demand? We'd have to have double the volume of production. If we had that, if there's twice the spending to buy now twice the goods, what would be the effect on the price level? It would be the same, would be unchanged. So 2 times the spending at the same prices, that will be a doubled real demand. But what is it that allows the price level to be unchanged when spending doubles? What makes it possible for the price level to be unchanged when spending doubles? That production must double. If production doubles, then double the spending can represent double the real demand. But notice, for more money and spending ever to represent more real demand, it's necessary, it's essential that they be accompanied by correspondingly more production and supply. If they're not, if there's no increase in production and supply, there's no increase in real demand. So a way to put this is, as I say it in point B, it takes more supply. It requires more supply to make a larger monetary demand into a larger real demand. Thus, more supply is necessary for the creation of more real demand. More monetary demand by itself is not sufficient. It wouldn't do the job. If that were all that were present, there'd be no increase in real demand emanating from more monetary demand. Only to the extent that it's accompanied by more production and supply can a larger monetary demand ever represent a larger real demand. But notice further, and this is point C, but it doesn't take more monetary demand. It doesn't take more monetary demand to create a larger real demand. More supply will do it by itself with the same monetary demand by way of reducing prices. And if it's a larger supply of labor that's in question, wage rates. So if we have more production and supply, we can have more real demand with or without more money. But if all we have is more money, we won't have more real demand. It's more production and supply that are the essential element in greater real demand, not more money. Is that clear, that it's production and supply that are the essential thing for more real demand? That if they're present, then a greater monetary demand will be a greater real demand, because prices will not rise to the same extent as the volume of spending. But if more monetary demand isn't present, there'll still be a greater real demand through a fall in prices. It's more production and supply that are the essential element in more real demand. And I say here in the concluding paragraph, thus more supply is both necessary and sufficient for the creation of real demand, more real demand. That's all you need, is more production and supply. You'll have more real demand, with or without more monetary demand. So supply, not more money, is what counts for real demand. More money is neither necessary nor sufficient. Only more supply creates more real demand. Okay. Now, let me try to zero in on what Say's law refers to. I have this point, the reference of Say's law. What is it pertaining to? And I say there are 2 elements I stress. Aggregate or economy-wide demand in real terms. Perhaps I shouldn't have the word demand stressed, the stress should be on aggregate or economy-wide and real. It's demand in the aggregate in real terms. Economy-wide demand in real terms. The economy-wide and the real are the two elements to stress. The economy-wide demand in real terms. That's what Say's law refers to. And this is something that, yes, Mr. Wilson?
Just kind of one clarification. When you say economy-wide, that can be in reference to like a single country or even global, depending on the nature of that industry? Or
Well, it could, depending on the context, it might be the economy just of a country. If practically all economic activity that went on in a country was within its own borders, then it would be countrywide. If the context has changed and the country is intimately involved in the world market extensively, then the economy-wide would probably have to be taken globally. So it depends on the context. Now, what is important to realize is, which is often overlooked, that Say's law does not refer to things industry by industry or company by company. It is not saying, definitely not saying, that if the supply of the product of any particular industry increases, that this will result in correspondingly more real demand for the products of that industry. It might happen, or it might not happen. It's perfectly possible that when the supply of a particular industry increases, the real demand for the product of that industry might actually decrease. But what Say's law refers to is the effect of the larger supply of the product of an industry on real demand in the economy as a whole. Larger supply on demand in the economy as a whole.
can you think of examples? To where
Yeah, I'll be giving you examples. We'll see that very, very shortly. We'll be dealing with a case in which a particular industry produces more. The real demand for its product actually declines, yet at the same time, economy-wide real demand increases. And what actually is brought out in such a case, as I put it at the end of this paragraph, is that the larger supply of the product itself is what constitutes the larger real demand in the economy as a whole. It's the larger supply of the product itself that constitutes the larger real demand in the economy as a whole. Now, we need to concretize this, and this is what point C is all about, the confirmation of Say's law by cases apparently contradicting it. And I refer to the potato example, first in barter, then in money. Now here we are, I picked potatoes because potatoes are a good that in every significant country, virtually everybody has all of the potatoes he'd like to have. People are not particularly eager to get more potatoes. Now, let's assume the supply of potatoes were to double. Imagine that there was some discovery made that enabled the potato growers in a very short time to produce double the supply of potatoes. But we're not keen to have double the supply of potatoes. The use for the extra supply might end up being just to feed pigs or something of that kind. And what kind of price would be required in order to find buyers for this doubled supply? Much lower. I assume you're all familiar with the concept of an inelastic demand. Mm-hmm. Well, the demand for potatoes is highly inelastic, which would mean if the supply of potatoes were to double, the price would fall by more than half. Now, for analytical purposes, we need to choose convenient numbers to make our work as easy as possible. So the first simple integer fraction that is less than a half is a third. So if we assume that when the supply of potatoes doubles, the price will fall to a third, well, what's that imply about expenditure on potatoes? If there's twice the supply of potatoes that are sold at 1/3 the price, what's the answer to the higher mathematical problem 2 times 1/3. 2/3. So that's the revenue of the potato growers. They take in less revenue. And let's initially develop this in the context of a barter economy where it's goods exchanging against goods. In the barter economy, the potato growers would be bringing their potatoes to market. They would trade some of the bushels for eggs, other bushels for shoes, other bushels for iron nails, on and on and on. And now we've got the potato growers coming to market with twice the quantity of potatoes. And what's fallen is the exchange ratios in barter. So it used to be perhaps that a bushel of potatoes would exchange for 12 eggs. Now a bushel of potatoes exchanges for 4 eggs, 1/3 the barter price. A bushel of potatoes previously exchanged for 3 yards of cloth. Now it exchanges for 1 yard of cloth, and on, 1/3. What would be implied about the physical volume of goods being given to the potato growers in exchange for their doubled supply of potatoes? How much less? 1/3 less. It would be 2/3 of what it used to be. Yes, Mr. Whitesides.
And so you're not factoring in government subsidies. You're just saying in a free market, right?
Yeah, we'll make it as uncomplicated as possible.
Right.
So we can put aside things like subsidies. Here we are. We simply have twice the output of potatoes, and the barter price falls to 1/3. So what is the situation of the potato growers?
They lose money.
They're taking in less than before. Now, the reason I bring this case up is here are the potato growers. They've doubled their supply, right?
Right.
And Say's law is maintaining that when the supply increases, that's what brings about an increase in demand. Supply creates its own demand. Well, the potato growers, if they didn't pay careful attention to what Say's law actually meant, they would think, here they are offering 2 bushels of potatoes. They used to get 3 units of other goods let this represent a bushel of potatoes. They used to get 3 units of other goods for their 1 bushel of potatoes. Now they're getting 1 unit for 1 bushel. They also have a second bushel, so they take in 2 units. Notice the other goods demand for potatoes. The demand for potatoes in terms of goods other than potatoes, it used to be 3 units. Now it's 2, right? So from the perspective of the potato growers, it would appear, here we are, we've got more supply. What's happened to the damn demand? It's supposed to be more, but it's less, right? Now, this is an apparent contradiction if you're forgetting the context, if you're ignoring the fact that Say's law is not about the individual industry, it's about the economy as a whole. And even though the real demand for potatoes has fallen from 3 to 2, accompanying the doubling of the supply, real demand in the economy as a whole will increase to precisely the same extent as the increase in the supply of potatoes. Now, how does that work? Well, here we are, the producers of goods other than potatoes, they're no longer giving this unit to the potato growers. So the egg producer has 4 eggs left over. The cloth producer has a yard of cloth left over, and on, case by case. What are these producers doing with the goods they no longer have to give to the potato growers? They exchange them among themselves. So there is a reduced demand in terms of goods other than potatoes for potatoes, but what has happened to the demand for things other than potatoes in terms of things other than potatoes? It's gone up. There's 1 less for potatoes, 1 more for things other than potatoes, okay? Now, the kicker is, what has happened to the demand for things other than potatoes in terms of potatoes? In a barter economy, when the potato growers go shopping, what is the currency that they're using to obtain the things that they want? Potatoes. And what has happened to the volume of potatoes that they're offering in exchange for things other than potatoes? They're offering twice the potatoes. So there are 3 components of demand involved here. There's the other goods demand for potatoes. The other goods demand for potatoes. and this is what I've got up here in Table 13.1. The other goods demand for potatoes is down by 1/3. The other goods demand for other goods is up by an equivalent amount, as the customers of the potato growers use their savings from the purchase of potatoes in exchange with one another. So to this extent, what has happened? If we look simply at elements 1 and 2, where are we in terms of economy-wide aggregate demand? It's unchanged. There's a drop for the potato growers, an equivalent increase for the producers of things other than potatoes. But now there's the third element. The potato demand for other goods is increased by an amount precisely equal to the increase in the supply of potatoes brought to the market. There's twice the potato demand for everything else. There's twice the potatoes offered for shoes, twice the potatoes offered for eggs, twice the potatoes offered for cloth, everything. And if we add up all of the components of demand, we see the other goods demand for potatoes is down some, the other goods demand for other goods is up equivalently, the potato demand for other goods has increased to precisely the same extent as the increase in the supply of potatoes. And the total aggregate demand has changed by the sum of these three items together. The effect on aggregate demand is the sum of items 1, 2, and 3 together. And when we add that up, then what is the effect on economy-wide aggregate demand? It's increased. You say it's the same? It's increased to the extent of the increase in the supply of potatoes. Now, we will come to the exact same result when we go over the case in terms of a monetary economy. Now, we'll drop the assumption of barter and assume everyone is selling his goods or services for money. So here are the potato growers. They come to market, and they've got twice the supply of potatoes. And we'll assume that the money price of potatoes drops to 1/3. The money price of potatoes is going to be 1/3 of what it used to be. Well, what's the effect of that on the sales revenues of the potato industry?
1/3.
1/3. It's 2/3 of what it used to be, right? Now, what are people doing with the money that they used to spend in buying potatoes but no longer do? They're spending it on other things, right? So the total aggregate demand in terms of money is unchanged. There's less for potatoes, equivalently more for the rest of the economy. And what has happened to the economy-wide aggregate supply that this unchanged monetary demand now buys? It's increased to what extent?
2/3.
Which is it's increased in the proportion of the decrease in the potatoes.
Well, what good has increased? What element of supply has increased?
Other.
Dollars.
Potatoes have increased in supply.
Potatoes have increased. Potatoes is the only thing that's increased. The only good whose physical supply has increased is potatoes. There's twice the supply of potatoes. There's twice the supply of everything else is unchanged. The total amount of money spent in the economy is unchanged. Less of it is spent for potatoes, more of it is spent for other goods, but that's a wash. And what does the same total amount of money spent now buy compared to what it used to buy?
More goods.
It buys more to the extent there's more potatoes.
Just like your table salt.
Well, it's similar, I guess, but in this case, there is more potatoes. Now, naturally, from the perspective of the economy as a whole, the potato industry is small potatoes. So when the supply of potatoes doubles, if we translate that into terms of economy-wide aggregate supply, well, that's certainly not a doubling of economy-wide aggregate supply. If we took the potato industry as representing 1/10 of 1% of the whole economy, which maybe it roughly does, I don't know. If it represented 1/10 of 1% and now it's doubled, then how big is the new aggregate supply compared to the original aggregate supply? What's the increase if potatoes have doubled and potatoes represent 1/10 of 1%? Well, it's increased by 1/10 of 1%, whatever it was. The initial amount is 100. Take the initial supply as 100, and now we add 1/10 of 1%, we had 0.001, I guess. The total aggregate supply will be 1.001 larger than it was before. And if the same total expenditure is now buying 1.001 what it used to buy, well, what has happened to the real demand? What's happened to real demand? It's increased. To what extent? To 0.001, which is the exact same extent to which the supply of potatoes taken as part of aggregate supply has increased. So at the aggregate level, the increase in the supply of potatoes is increasing economy-wide aggregate demand, even though the potato growers are suffering. See, if you look at things merely from the perspective of one industry, you can come to the conclusion that Say's law is nuts. Here's more supply, and in a case like this, the demand is less for that industry. But that's not what Say's law is about. Say's law is about economy-wide aggregate demand in real terms. And when you keep that in mind, then aggregate demand has indeed increased to the exact same extent as the increase in supply. And this is always the case with respect to aggregate real demand. And I think perhaps it's easiest to grasp in the conditions of barter. If we were exchanging goods for goods, what would be required to increase demand? What would be required so that the people you were dealing with, who were trading for your goods, were offering more to you? What would have to be going on for the average seller to be receiving more from other producers?
Mass production on your end.
For the average seller in the economic system to be receiving more from other producers in a barter economy. Pardon me?
Supply would have to increase.
Supply would have to increase. I think Mr. Sweeney was coming to that too. So you just think in order for the producers of shoes to be taking in more eggs, wheat, cloth, nails, whatever, and the producers of everything, pretty much, to be taking in more of everything, what has to be going on?
There has to be more of those things too.
More of those things have to be produced. More things have to be produced. In a barter economy, the way things are acquired in exchange is by offering products. And in order to have more aggregate demand, you need to have more production and supply. Well, that is true in a monetary economy too, in terms of real demand.
I'm not sure I follow that completely. Maybe you can explain it a different way. I think in terms of supply and demand, as far as if there's less supply, then the demand for that product is higher. If there's less supply, the dollar value for that product is higher.
If there is less supply of a particular product, it may be sometimes that the total dollar value will be higher. And that's the case in the potato example, right? Suppose we just reversed it. Suppose we started off, the potato growers are producing their larger production, and they're taking in 2 units of money where they used to take in 3. And what would be the effect if they now went back to their earlier production of just 1 unit? Then they'd be taking in 3 units of money, right? But that would be an increase in the monetary demand for potatoes, right? Okay, but what would it imply about the monetary demand for things other than potatoes?
Reduces.
It'll go down. All right, and how much would the same total monetary demand across the whole economy now be buying? It would be buying less to the extent there were less potatoes. It's very often in economics, people make a confusion because of these circumstances. It's true that very often when there is less supply, the monetary value of that industry will be higher. When there's a greater supply, it will be lower. That in fact is the case we're dealing with. And the confusion that is often made was identified quite a few generations ago as a confusion between monetary value and riches, or real wealth. And if you ever have the time, there's one of the major economic classics by an early classical economist named David Ricardo, a book called Principles of Political Economy and Taxation. And one of his chapters is value and riches, their distinctive properties. And what you see, it's true that sometimes a lesser supply may enrich the producers in that particular industry. But can it enrich the economic system? If there's a smaller supply of potatoes, that might temporarily enrich the potato growers. But what is its effect on wealth in the economic system as a totality? It reduces it, because to the extent that the potato growers have more monetary value, what's the effect on the monetary value of other industries? It's that much less. And overall, we have the same monetary value, and what's it buying? What's the same total monetary value now buying? Less. So the real demand is less. The real demand is less when the supply is less. Now, you could increase the total monetary demand across the board, but to the extent you do that and there's no increase in supply, is there any increase in real demand? No. Okay. So here, I think this table spells it out. The way it works out is the increase in aggregate real demand comes down to the increase in the supply of potatoes itself. The increase in demand is felt not by the potato growers, but by the producers of things other than potatoes. They experience a twofold increase in the demand for their products. Where is the increase in demand for things like shoes, eggs, cloth, etc.? What are the sources of the increase in demand for these things other than potatoes? There's two elements to the increase in their demand. Pardon me? I'm sorry? Well, in a certain sense, but more specifically.
The other goods?
Yes?
The other goods? Such as shoes?
Okay, the producers of things other than potatoes are benefiting from the reduction in the demand for potatoes in terms of other goods. They're getting what used to go to the potato growers. That's one element. So the potato growers are taking in less, that's true, but the producers of things other than potatoes, they're taking in that much more. That's 0.2 versus 0.1. And then further, the demand for goods other than potatoes is increased by the additional supply of potatoes. So the demand for things other than potatoes goes up for two causes. One of them is equal to the decline in demand for potatoes, and the other is the increase in the supply of potatoes. And that's the overall net increase. Now, this example of the potato growers is actually very, very pregnant intellectually. It's pregnant. It will deliver more enlightening material. It's filled with meaning. And this leads us into the next point, Say's law and economic adjustment. Partial, relative overproduction, but never general or absolute overproduction. Now, let's look at the plight of the potato growers. Here they are. They've doubled their output, but what's happened to their standard of living? It's sharply reduced. But the standard of living of people outside the potato industry is more than equivalently increased. It's increased, A, equivalent to the reduction of the potato growers, and B, increased further by the increase in the supply of potatoes. So the gain is greater than the loss. But if this situation of the low price of potatoes is going to be protracted, what's implied about the profitability of continuing to be a potato grower? It's not as worthwhile as giving up potato growing and going out into other lines. Now, here we are. The potato growers are initially earning less than they used to earn. The immediate effect of their doubling of production is they're earning only 2/3 what they used to earn. We could reasonably expect that some of the potato growers will quit potato growing, right? Now, as they do, what will happen to the supply of potatoes?
Goes down.
It'll go down. It'll be less than double. It will retreat from double. Now, if we assume that every potato grower, each and every grower, had become twice as productive, that each and every grower could now grow twice the potatoes that he could to begin with, how many potato growers would have to leave well, 50% would have to leave to get back to the old supply of potatoes. Now, if we got back to the old supply of potatoes and the old price of potatoes, the initial price, then anyone who is producing potatoes at the initial price and producing twice as many, what would be his income?
Double.
He would have double the income. He'd be a prince in the economic system. So that would be too big a reduction. Now just think, what kind of price of potatoes would be necessary to enable the remaining potato growers, on the assumption that they can now produce 2 bushels as easily as they used to produce 1, what sort of price would be required so that you'd at least earn the same revenue and income on the 2 bushels that you used to earn on the 1?
Reduce the cost.
Not 2/3 the revenue, but the same revenue. What supply, or rather, what price of potatoes would be required so that those who remained as potato growers would earn at least the same kind of income they did? Yeah, if the price of potatoes could be brought up from 1/3 to 1/2 of its initial level, getting it up from 1/3 to 1/2, then whoever remained as a potato grower would at least be earning as good an income as he did at the beginning, right? Now, pardon me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, is there some supply of potatoes that is less than double, but more than the initial supply that should produce a price of 1/2? There must be some supply. Now, we don't know in advance what it is. I mean, it's conceivable that the supply required to get the price to 1/2 might be, instead of the doubled supply, 1.1, or it could be 1.8. Now, in order to make our mental work as easy as possible, we'll pick an easier number to work with. We'll assume 1.5. We'll assume if the supply of potatoes could be brought down from double to 3/2 right in the middle, that would be sufficient to get the price up to 1/2. There has to be some price, and we could alter the example to go some supply. And we could alter the example, but it would be more complicated. So, assuming that it's 3/2 the initial supply, that satisfies the basic requirement. The supply needs to be reduced. We pick a simple level to which it needs to be reduced. Now, if the supply needs to be cut from double to 3/2, and the average grower is producing double, how many growers do we need now to produce 3/2? Each grower produces twice what he used to. What times 2 equals 3/2? 75%, 3/4. 2 times 3/4, that's 6/4, that's 1.5. So 3/4 the growers will now serve to produce 3/2 the supply. And when 3/2 the supply is produced, then what's the income of the average grower? The same as it was to begin with. And 1/4 of the growers have left. They've fanned out through the rest of the economic system. No one may know exactly where each of them has gone, but they are around in different locations. And as they move into the rest of the economy, what will be the effect on the premium incomes that had temporarily been earned elsewhere? They'll diminish. So now, where would we end up in terms of the average level of money incomes in the economic system?
Equilibrium is achieved at that point.
I'm sorry?
An equilibrium is achieved at that point.
There's an equilibrium, and the equilibrium, I think, is implied at a level of money income that's no different than it was at the very beginning. The average member of the economy would be earning the same amount of money he did before. Initially, or temporarily, people outside of potato growing earned somewhat of a premium. People in potato growing were suffering terribly. Now they're no longer suffering. They've worked their way back up. The premiums are eliminated. So the potato growers are back up. They're earning comparable incomes to what everyone else is earning. There's no premium elsewhere. But there's a significant difference, and that is, what is the price of potatoes?
Half to what it was.
It's half of what it was initially, and what is implied about the amount of money the average member of the economy spends in buying potatoes, this 50% larger amount,
Real money.
how much does the average person spend in buying the 50% more?
Same as the original.
I'm hearing the same, half.
How much are they spending to buy 50% more? How much are they spending to buy the same?
How much are they spending to buy whatever it is, the 50% more that they're buying? They're getting, the average member of the economy is getting 3/2 the potatoes, right?
Right.
And the price of potatoes is 1/2 of what it was. So how much is the average person spending to obtain 3/2 the potatoes?
75%.
75%. What is 3/2 times 1/2? You're getting the average buyer is getting 3/2 the potatoes. Not each and every individual. There are some who might not buy any more. There are some who buy double. The average buyer is getting 3/2 the quantity of potatoes at 1/2 the price. So how much money is the average buyer spending on his potatoes? What's 3/2 times 1/2? 3/4, which is, of course, 75%. 3/2 times 1/2, 3/2 the quantity, times 1/2 the price is 3/4 the expenditure. So the average person is spending 3/4 as much as he used to in buying potatoes, and he's getting 50% more potatoes. Now, what is the average person doing with the 25% of the money he used to spend in buying potatoes? He's buying other things. And now, what is there present that makes possible a physical expansion in the production of these other things?
The more additional bodies of labor that are there.
Isn't the labor, there's 1/4 of the labor released from potato growing. 1/4 of the labor has been released from potato growing. They're available to step up the production of the other things that people are buying with the money they save from potato growing, from buying potatoes. Now, if we look at the effect of this on all of the relevant parties in the economy, if you never had any connection with potato growing at all, except as a consumer, what's the long-run effect of these developments on you after the dust has settled?
You have more money to spend on other things.
You're getting 50% more potatoes for 3/4 the expenditure, and you have that money left over, and that enables you to obtain more of other things, which can actually be produced on the foundation of the labor released from potato growing. It doesn't mean that the ex-potato growers themselves have to produce precisely the things you're buying. They can bump other people who then go to produce those other things. Yes, Mr. Rosendahl?
My question is, what if that additional, that 25% that's not spent on potatoes, spent elsewhere, is not spent but saved?
Even if it's saved, when money is saved, what is done with the savings?
Lent out?
They're lent out, yeah.
What if it's not saved in the conventional manner? What if the person puts it under their pillow?
All right, now, if we had a situation where people decide they want to increase their cash holdings, what would that do to the volume of spending? The overall volume of spending?
It would decrease?
Oh, it would decrease it. There'd be a lesser volume of expenditure. Then the system would have to adjust at a lower level of wages and prices. But we'll assume that people have satisfactory cash holdings. They don't want to put the money under the mattress. They are prepared to spend as much as before, but they'll just spend it in different lines. I think that's the much more reasonable assumption. So now, in this way, we've seen that the great body of people who were only related to potatoes as consumers, they have a clear benefit. Even after the dust has settled, they're getting more potatoes for a lesser expenditure, which permits them also to get more of other things that are produced on the foundation of labor released from potato growing. All right, what's the situation with respect to people who used to be potato growers and who had to get out of potato growing and fan out into the rest of the economy? Once they've learned other lines of work to the same extent as they used to know potato growing, what kind of incomes should we expect them to make in other lines? Pardon me? Comparable incomes to what they had been making in potato growing. Now, if they do, then what's the effect on them? The same as the effect on the great mass of people they will benefit ultimately from the improvement that initially displaced them. They'll be earning, after they've retrained and adapted, they'll be earning a comparable level of income in some other line, and then they too, in their capacity as consumers, will be faced with a lower price of potatoes, get more of them for less expenditure, and have the means left over to buy more of other things. And then finally, what about those who have remained in potato growing? What's the effect on them after potato growing has been cut back from double to 1.5? And they're earning a comparable level of income to what they had been.
Their quality of life is going up.
They've improved too. So the long-run effect is that everybody improves. And I think you can see this plainly illustrated historically. We've had radical improvements in agricultural production. What have many of the sons and daughters of farmers had to do, because it was not economical to stay on the farms, they'd find employment elsewhere. And what's been the effect on the standard of living of everybody of these improvements? And what was the effect, do you think, on the standard of living of the blacksmiths of the coming of the automobile for those blacksmiths who made an adjustment and found another line of work? It ended up improved too. They too got the benefit of the automobile. Mr. Winchell, I didn't mean to put you off.
In your example, there's 25% more potatoes available for half the price.
50% more.
Oh, 50%.
Yeah.
But what happens if somebody doesn't want to buy more potatoes? Now, everybody's on the low cholesterol diets and they decide,
Okay.
potatoes for me.
All right,
So-
then the price would drop more steeply. Then we'd conceivably we could have a duplication of the table salt case. Change the example. Imagine that the productivity of labor in the production of table salt doubled, and we don't want any more table salt. Well, how would things end up in that case? We'd have half the number of people producing the same quantity of table salt, and they'd fan out through the rest of the economy. What would be the effect on total production and on real demand?
So then more people just leave the potato industry and go into other industries.
Yeah, if we didn't want any more potatoes, then you'd have to have a bigger drop. And even perhaps to the point where we end up with just the same quantity of potatoes. But then there's still a gain. We get more output in other lines. And those who remain, once you get down to just half the producers, they would earn the same level of incomes they used to earn, and in their capacity as consumers, they'd be getting the same salt more easily, and they'd have the ability to buy more of other things too.
The flip
Yes.
side of that is you now have potato growers that are also skilled in another trade.
That they have to learn
So
something,
you-
yeah.
So you have really improved their way of life, because if the new trade that they're in starts to fall, they could take a look at the potato growing and say, do I want to get back in? Look
Well,
at that, or
conceivably-
maybe retrain again.
Well, they'd have to retrain again. Now, the retraining issue will be different for different people. There are different periods of retraining. I think you need to look at it at least three broad levels. The level of unskilled labor. How long does it take to learn a typical unskilled job?
Not long.
Inconsequential. Maybe weeks, sometimes days or hours. So that's not an extensive retraining period. The unskilled workers, really, if you had a fully free labor market, they need have virtually no short-run loss. If it's skilled workers and you have a kind of skill that took us several years to acquire, well then, to acquire the same degree of skill in another line might take you that long before you'd earn a comparable level of income. And there would be many cases where people wouldn't earn a comparable level of income, and they'd be thereafter working at a lower level. So they might be set back for a very long time, or maybe for the rest of their lives. A more extreme case is someone who loses an invested fortune. Suppose you had $1 million invested in 1900 in a buggy whip factory, and you lose that. But I think it's generally much more difficult to re-earn a fortune than it is to acquire another job skill. And if you want to ask what's the effect in such cases where people will never make it back, I would say even then, if you take the real long view, they don't have a legitimate complaint. Just think of the effects of this process of improving production going back over a long period of time. What is it that enables any of us to have the kind of standard of living that we now have? What is it the reflection of looking back over many, many years?
Positional skill sets.
A continual improvement, right? And these improvements were disturbing to different people at different times. And so each of us is the beneficiary of generations of massive improvements and economic competition. Now, the effect of this on our standard of living is to have elevated it enormously. The reason we are where we are is because there were people who made all of these innovations, who improved the processes of production, and now we might be faced with a new competition which causes us to lose the benefit of an acquired skill or an acquired fortune. Well, suppose we take the extreme case, someone has lost $1 million and he'll never make it back. Well, what's the effect on him? He now has to live more or less as an average worker. Well, if we ask what is the effect on his standard of living of economic competition and economic progress taken as a general phenomenon, not one isolated instance, what's the effect of economic progress on this person's standard of living, even though now he's reduced to the ranks of the average wage earners rather than being a wealthy businessman?
It's far decreased.
Pardon me?
It's far decreased.
You say it's far decreased.
In the short term, absolutely. Probably for his lifetime. Sure. He
It's-
no longer can afford the servants he could. He can no longer
All right,
afford
now,
that.
but what is it that enables him to buy anything? What is it that enables him to have a car, to have a television set, to go to the movies, to get an antibiotic, to have a telephone, buy food? What is it that underlies all of this?
It's inheritance.
No. So what you're saying is, even though he lost it, it's better off for everyone because that's the way that it happens progressively throughout.
What happens progressively, and I would say an accurate description of the relationship of this individual to the phenomenon of economic competition and economic progress is that he is always an enormous positive gainer. But there can be, his gain at a later time may be significantly less than it was at an earlier time. So when you're a millionaire, your gains are huge. When you're reduced to the ranks of the average worker, your gains are still enormous, but not as enormous. It's always very positive if you hold the context. Now, what most people do, or many I should say, is they assume that the peak standard of living they ever had is theirs by some kind of divine right. And that's the starting point, that's the given, the indisputable given of the analysis. And then they only look at what pulls them down a notch or two. And they denounce whatever it is that's pulling them down a notch or two, even though that identical process is responsible for their being 100 floors above where they would otherwise have been. Yes.
Isn't that smack of socialism, though? That,
Which?
oh, it's all for the good of the people. Well, even yes, you can go down in your standard of living so that everyone else can have an improved standard of living in the future, that type of thing.
No, so that you could have had the standard of living you have now. You would never have had it. And also, you see, when you say, does this smack of socialism, what does it take to stop it? To stop the process of progress?
Oh,
Government intervention.
It would be government intervention. I'd like to use the example, imagine some buggy factory owner is suffering from the competition of old Ford. Now, if he writes a letter to Ford saying, don't you realize I haven't finished putting my daughter through finishing school? Why don't you wait till I've got these responsibilities off my hands? Is that going to make Ford stop? No. So what would it take to make Ford stop?
Government letters and stuff.
Senator.
Yeah, a letter to a senator or hire the mafia, one of the two. Less and less distinction, unfortunately. So that would be government control. That would do it. It's the government interfering that would stop the process. Okay. Yes, I see. You want to call my attention to the time, or okay? Last question then, and I'll get to you after the break. Okay, Mr. Weatherford.
Talking about the potatoes.
Yeah.
If we have natural disaster,
Yeah.
and that would naturally forces people to put their forces together and produce more potatoes, right? So probably the price of potatoes will be higher.
If there's something that reduces the supply of potatoes?
Yeah, like natural disasters.
Okay, yeah.
Even though the same analogy is creating wars,
How does this relate to wars?
that, for example, an economy would want to create a war so it can destroy something and rebuild it after. The artificial need to rebuild things.
No, there are people who believe that, but that's a fallacy. We don't gain from a process of destruction. That's the consumptionist idea. The consumptionists think we have a shortage of needs, that we don't need or desire enough. We only need or desire some fixed given amount, and a good war will add a new source of need. But our needs and desires for wealth have no limit. So the last thing that we need is artificial need creation. We don't need that. If you have a war, it's just detracting from your ability to produce other things. You don't grow prosperous by a war. You're always impoverished by war, or at least made less rich, which is not to say a country should never have a war. Sometimes it's necessary to the existence of the country and any kind of freedom, but it's always at a great expense. It's never a source of prosperity. Okay, Mr. Weatherford, then we got a break.
Any one event, such as the natural disaster that wipes out potato crops,
Yeah.
wouldn't the first reaction actually be substitution?
Well, for the time being, if there's no potatoes around, or very few, to that extent, there must be substitution. But then, to the extent there's a higher price, that could be expected to stimulate production the following year. Yeah. Okay, let's take a break at our proper time, and then we'll resume. Okay, looks like we have a quorum. So let me start off. Mr. Whiteside, did you have a question you wanted to raise?
Oh, I just wanted to add a question, Professor.
Yeah.
Just to clarify, I had some questions about our upcoming midterm, because we're all pretty nervous, and that you wrote the textbook, and you seem to know a lot about the subject, and we just want to make sure that we can, prove to you that we know a lot about it too. So we're going to be covering weeks 1 through 5, correct?
Yeah, the readings assigned under the headings 1 through 5, that's what you're responsible for on the midterm. The readings that appear under week 6 are geared for discussion following the midterm.
So that means that the test will be timed then?
Yeah, the test, I plan to time the test. I generally give 2 hours.
And do we know how many questions we should probably expect?
Yeah, roughly around 180, I think.
180?
Yeah.
Multiple choice?
They're multiple choice, true, false, no essays. Ms. Herrera? It's conceivable. There could be simple, no, it's not 3 per minute, I don't think. That's if you only.
180 for 2 hours?
2 hours, yeah. So that's.
I'm sorry, that's
yeah.
a little over 1.
Yeah.
45 seconds.
There's some simple, very simple calculations. Now, if this panics you, the time, it's okay with me, we can make it longer.
Okay, that's good.
All right, so let's run it, you can quit at 9. Okay, and then we can just call it a night at 9 if that's what you prefer. Okay, all right.
Less pressure.
Okay, I would expect that there'll be people leaving probably around 7:30, some people. Okay, so it doesn't look like we'll have much discussion, or any, after the exam, but then take the assignment that is under week 6. That's what you should come in prepared for on week 8.
Okay.
Okay? All right. Yeah, the readings under weeks 1 through 5, they're what you're responsible for in the midterm. Okay. Yes, Mr. Davis.
Again, to reiterate, the best way to prepare for that test might be to look at the short questions.
Well, the best way is to have diligently done the readings through the term.
But if you don't want to read anything and waste a lot of time.
I'm sure you speak from the perspective of many, but then you're at risk. So, I did try to stress at the very beginning not to leave it for the last weekend, and I'm sure many have. But
to contradict what he said is that there are no multiple choice questions that we can study from the Hazlitt, so we have to read the Hazlitt.
okay, at least you'll have done that. Yeah. Yes, Mr. Weatherford.
Well, to build off of that, if you look at the review materials, those multiple choice questions are in some cases, one question is a half a page long.
Well, there might be some significant length of a few questions, yeah.
I mean, you cannot complete a question like that and read it word for word in
Okay.
45 seconds.
Okay, well then, you've got extra time. It's going to run till 9 o'clock. Bring fold-away cots and we'll run it to the next meeting. Anything else?
I have a question now
Sure.
about the midterm.
Good, yeah.
Just before we left, and I know this has been a recurring theme, that it's said that people have limitless needs and wants for wealth. And I was considering that, thinking maybe it would be more accurate to say that people have limitless needs and wants for happiness, they're striving to be happy.
Yeah.
And it's not the accumulation of wealth, perceived notion of how to be happy. Anyway,
Yeah.
thought, in which case it wouldn't necessarily mean that because it wouldn't necessarily be a drive to produce. You might be happy at your current situation. Some people are. Some people do accept welfare or do accept homelessness or whatever.
Yeah.
They don't mind being indigent, for example. In which case, there's absolutely zero productivity in the sense of the economics.
You say there are people who don't mind being indigent. They don't mind not working, but why is it that they're asking for handouts?
Well,
They want more than they've got, and I don't think any of them would turn down a bigger handout or more handouts. So I think what is true is that there are many people, or a significant number at any rate, who, while they might want more wealth, they're not really willing to do very much to go out and obtain it. Now, I would agree that the happiness is more fundamental than wealth. We don't want wealth as an end in itself. We always want wealth as the means of accomplishing further things. But virtually anything you would want to do, any physical action on impacting the world, any enjoyable experience, virtually everything depends on the employment of wealth. Okay.
I just meant by that happiness might actually be a limiting factor in that, because people might say at a certain point, like you said, I have enough wealth. Even though I could produce more, I'm not going to.
Well, people, you see, people also value leisure. And in their leisure, they value the application of wealth. But I would think, even though people value leisure, if you ask in the time you are willing to work, would you rather earn more or less? They would rather earn more. And to some degree, they might want to earn more to have more leisure. Yes, Mr. Taylor?
Yes. Would you accept a complaint as a result, or a complaint?
I'm sorry?
Would you accept a complaint about the effects of your text?
The effects?
Yeah.
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah. So I was sharing with my wife the section where you talk about that animals are different than humans, and humans require wealth, the unlimited amount of wealth, because they're stimulated intellectually, by new things, having new gadgets and new things.
Yeah.
And the problem is that how that impacts your budget at home.
Yeah.
When your wife then says, "Oh, that's great. That explains why you should let me go and buy new shoes." On a weekly basis.
Yeah.
So that's what it is.
Well, you're giving an illustration of the limitless need and desire for wealth.
But joking aside, I got excited about that for a moment.
Yeah.
All kidding aside, I got excited about that for a moment.
Yeah.
Because I'm a proponent of growth and trying to build more.
Yeah.
But then when you're counseling around and you're struggling with the idea of building up ultimate wealth in a society, in our country, the question is, how do you deal with the balance of this type of mantra, which says, build it so that you can buy more things, with the issue around, if someone just takes that literally and goes and spends, then true wealth ultimately really is not accomplished.
Well, you see, a limitless need and desire for wealth doesn't mean that we want to get everything we can in the present moment. Anyone who's saving, if he saved less or didn't save at all, he could buy more in the present moment, but then what would be happening to him in the future? You see, the desire for wealth has a time horizon involved, and the more rational we are, the more long range we are, and so what we would really want is more wealth viewed over the course of our lifetimes. We'd really like to have a higher level of wealth throughout our lives, and hopefully more as the years pass. See, it's always nice to be able to look forward to things being better in the future than they are in the present. You can tolerate the present more easily that way. If we have someone who wiped himself out on a big fling in the present, that wouldn't be a course of action conducive to wealth or to happiness. Yeah. Okay, well, let me turn to related matters here. I'm going to go ahead and develop this point E briefly, rounding out the picture, Say's law and competition, and then I'm going to return back to D, because there's a lot more to say in connection with it. Yes, is this? Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you very much. Let's see if I can activate it. Okay, there we go. Thank you very much. I have to reduce it. No. Now, the example I gave you with the potato growers, I postulated that there was this dramatic improvement in their productive ability, and yet everybody in that industry ended up losing by it, at least temporarily. The potato growers were suffering a major reduction in income as an industry. And I wouldn't be surprised if some of you were thinking, well, how can we reconcile this with the fact that the source of introducing the improvements that increase our ability to produce is the profit motive. People are introducing more efficient methods in order to increase their wealth and income, not, as the potato growers, to suffer a loss. So it's necessary to reconcile that and to show how those who are introducing the process of progress are able to profit from it, even though the conditions of the industry as a whole are essentially those in our potato growers example. All we have to do is modify the assumption of the whole industry all at once, overnight, doubling its production. The way improvements, it's possible that something like that could occur, and then the analysis I gave would be fully applicable. But I think in most cases, when you have an industry like potato growing, where the demand is inelastic, those who introduce the innovations are still in a position to profit. The losses borne by the industry as a whole are suffered by that part of the industry which has not introduced the innovation. And we can bring that out by elaborating our example or modifying it somewhat. And the point is to show how those who introduce improvements usually benefit from them, even if the industry as a whole loses. And here we are. I have a spreadsheet. I'll need to reduce this. Okay. We need to break the industry up into segments. Let this represent the potato industry. And here we are. The total industry is initially producing an output of 1. And there are two elements in the industry. There's one I've labeled the progressive part. This is the part that's going to introduce the innovation. It initially accounts for 10% of the industry. Then there's the rest of the industry, which initially doesn't introduce the innovation. And the doubling of production is initially confined just to this 1/10 of the industry, this progressive part that now increases its output to an amount equal to 2/10 of the industry's initial output. So the industry's total output is now going to be 1.1. 1/10 has doubled, that adds a tenth. The total is 1.1. Now, if the demand is inelastic, which it is, all that requires is that the price fall in greater degree than the quantity produced increases. So we have the quantity produced in total being 11/10, 1.1 to 1, and the price has to fall in greater proportion than 10 to 11. So let's assume the price is 0.8. We have a 10% increase in the supply, a 20% reduction in the price. That's an inelastic demand. Okay, what will be the effect on the revenue of the whole industry that's producing 1.1 times as much, but selling it at 8/10 the price? What's happened to revenues in the industry as a whole? It's less, it's 0.88, right? But what's happened to the revenue of this particular segment, this initial 1/10, they're now producing the equivalent of 2/10. They sell 0.2, they sell an output of 0.2 at the price of 0.8. What has happened to their revenues compared to what they were initially?
60%.
They're up, now it's 0.16, it used to be 0.1. They have a substantial increase in their revenues, so it can be profitable for them. Notice they're in a position to do better, even while the industry as a whole does worse. They're up 0.6, the industry as a whole is down 0.12, and the other 9/10 of the industry, they're down much more. They're down 0.18. That part of the industry used to take in 0.9, that was their revenue. They took in 0.9 of the revenue, and now they're producing 0.9 still, but they're producing 0.9 at a price of 0.8, so they've gone from 0.9 to 0.72. Their revenue has dropped 0.18. They absorb the loss of the whole industry and provide the profit of the progressive 10%. So the innovators who are introducing the improvement, they're still gaining. It's the industry as a whole that's losing, but the losses are borne by the part of the industry that has not adopted the innovation. They have a loss equal to the loss of the industry as a whole plus the profit of this innovating portion. Now, when we look at the improvement, at the doubling of output per unit in potato growing, and we give it some time to work out, well, where are the people leaving potato growing going to come from? From what part of the industry will they come from? Not from the 10% that's improving. The group that leaves will be coming from the 90% of the industry that hasn't innovated. Now, anyone who's remaining in the industry, what will they be attempting to do? To innovate. So they'll be adopting the innovation, and then it may be that one segment of the industry is leaving, a part that's remaining is improving, they're becoming more productive, and it might be, if we looked at this thing in stages, well, now we have a second 1/10 that doubles its production, and the total supply is now maybe 1.15 or 1.18. The price drops further. The gains of the innovators are still there, but they're diminishing. And it could conceivably work out that everybody who adopts the innovation either is better off than he was at the beginning for a time, and the last adopter ends up being just as well off as he was in the beginning, not better off. And the whole burden of loss is on those who have not adopted the innovation. So that from the perspective of the individual firms, the adoption of the innovation is always the more profitable thing to do.
I'm sorry, would you repeat your last paragraph when you said the impact of the last adopter?
Yeah, the last adopter, he is moving from a loss-making position, and now he's getting back to where he was before the whole process started. Remember, we pointed out that the end result would be that those who remained in potato growing would be as well off as they were at the beginning, because the price would recover. Well, the last adopter of the innovation would be moving from a position of temporary loss, getting back to where he was before the process improved. So it could work out, doesn't absolutely have to, but I think this would be the case more often than not, that there is always financial improvement in the adoption of the improvement. There's always financial gain in the adoption of the improvements. Not like in our original discussion, the entire industry loses because they all adopted it once. I think that while that could happen, the more likely pattern is that limited parts of the industry progressively adopt the improvement, and each one who does is actually earning greater profit than he did before, or at least going from a loss to getting back to where he was at the beginning. Yes, Mr. Barton.
Is this graph that you just put up here, is this something that we need to be able to, say, explain on the exam, and if so?
I wouldn't ask you an essay question like this.
No, but I mean, maybe two. Well, do we need to know, do we need to know for the exam? My point is, since it's not in the book, I haven't been able to find it, could that be emailed to us on the portal so that we could have a copy of that and be able to look at it?
Let me see if it's not in the book. I'd be surprised if it isn't. I think it is in the book. Let me enlarge this.
The example is, it's on page 569.
569. Let's see. Yeah, it's in the book. Let's see, where does it start? It must start on the page before.
No, it starts right at the top of that column.
It starts right at the top? Yeah, the exact same example I've given you is in the book.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Now, the question comes to mind that the person or the company is the last to innovate.
Yeah.
And they've been losing money all along, and now they've now come back to just where they were. They're never going to recover that money they've lost. I mean, it's
no, like, they would be poorer than they were at the beginning. Yeah, that would be the implication. Yeah. But whoever is going to remain has to adopt the innovation. I suppose you're in business and you're meeting foreign competition or whatever, and your competitors are selling at lower costs at lower prices than correspond to your costs. Well, what must you do if you're going to remain in that business?
You better catch up.
You must catch up. Either do that or get out. So if you're going to stay, you've got to catch up. And when you do catch up, you'll be better off than you are attempting to remain in the industry without catching up. And it might be that for quite a while, the innovators, the early adopters, and for some time after, they're more profitable than they were at the beginning, though in diminishing degree, and ultimately there's no special profit at all attaching to the innovation.
But that kind of leads to the rich get richer kind of theory, and that they've now had some additional profits, which then allow them to do further innovations, which may make
well, that might happen, but it's not like here in the example we gave. You have this innovative 10% of the industry. They're starting off relatively small. They're the ones who are getting richer. See, the ones who are getting richer are I would say, pardon me?
They're the ones who choose to make the change.
Yeah, the adopters.
Yeah.
If you talk about the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer, I think we have some dramatic counter examples. The company that used to be far and away the richest company in the economic system was AT&T. And from the looks of things, they're on their way out of existence. In 1980, I don't think anybody heard of Microsoft. And they're now either the wealthiest firm, or their stock is valued the highest in the world. So this is quite a reversal. If you look at a list of the firms in the Fortune 500, you'll find there are many, many firms that weren't there 10 or 20 years ago, and there are many that were there 10 or 20 years ago that have long since gone out of existence.
But the companies that continue to prosper are companies that continue to innovate.
Yeah.
Continue to push the limit and continue to try to expand.
And that's what they have to do. You see, an excellent model of continual innovation, at least until very recently, has been Intel. And I think this is a pattern of profit-making across the board. You can make an exceptional profit on the foundation of introducing a newer, better product or a more efficient method of producing an existing product. Those are the two leading ways.
But the rich get richer until they decide not to continue to innovate, until they rest on their laurels.
Well, they may rest on their laurels, and they don't have the ability to innovate, or there are others who are out-innovating them. And if you notice, the same point about the Fortune 500, I think applies to the great fortunes. At one time, one of the wealthiest people was John Jacob Astor and Commodore Vanderbilt. How prominent are their descendants? Not very. They're far surpassed by Gates and Dell and Paul Allen, people who don't come from rich parents, and even the heirs of Rockefeller. At one time, they were the main fortune in the country, but I think collectively, all of the descendants of Rockefeller combined are worth less than $1 billion. And here's Gates, who's at last report is $48 billion. And then there's Warren Buffett, reported at $41 billion. He didn't come from particularly wealthy parents, I don't believe. So there's a lot more churning going on, and it really is fallacious to assume that the rich are getting richer. You see, what's true is if you have continual ability, if you have significant ability and you continue to apply it, the wealth you gain from the earlier applications of your ability can be the foundation of then applying your ability later on a bigger scale. So there's Michael Dell. When he was in college at the University of Texas, he was supposedly selling computers out of his dorm room and making some money that way. And you can be sure he saved and reinvested the bulk of that money, and then he was able to apply further innovations with a bigger capital, made more money, and kept innovating, and can do it on a bigger and bigger scale. But if he loses that ability to innovate, if others surpass him, then his profits will shrink. He can consume more than he's making. His heirs will probably not be able to continue his performance. So, pardon me?
That's good. I like that.
Okay, well, you see, there's a basic optimism connected with sound economics. And to say a related word on this subject, people very often talk about the equality of opportunity. They want the equality of opportunity. I don't know, but did we have a discussion of this? The equality of opportunity? And I begin by asking, well, at some point they need a new CEO of General Motors. And I was not given any opportunity to get that job. I had no equality of opportunity. Well, who has such an opportunity?
The COO.
Well, maybe some other high officer of General Motors, or high officer of Ford, or some other major company. There's a limited number of people who've climbed within the range of possibly being considered, and the immense majority of people have no chance at that at all. So, in order to have opportunities, you have to bring something to the table. Your opportunities are commensurate with what you bring to the table. And people are in a position over the course of their lifetimes progressively to improve what they bring to the table and to widen their opportunities. So it could be someone at the age of 18 gets a low-level job at General Motors. And he does that exceptionally well. He's noticed, he gets a promotion. He does that well, and now that he's in this higher position, still higher positions come within reach. Opportunity should be thought of as climbing the rungs of a ladder. What you've done up to the present moment, that determines how far you've advanced, what opportunities will be open to you. And the key thing with opportunity is not that they should be equal, they can't be equal really, but that people should have the freedom to exploit the best of the opportunities open to them at the time. If they can do that, then they'll have better opportunities later on. The idea of equality of opportunity, most people think, well, if you come from poor parents, you don't have an equal opportunity. It's just wealth. But if you think about it further, doesn't it make a difference to a child whether his parents love him or hate him? Or what kind of education his parents have? all sorts of things. Now, what would you have to do to really achieve equality of opportunity in the sense of everyone having the same upbringing, having the same genetic inheritance? They say, does a child who's born with the genes to become intelligent and beautiful, are they do they begin life with the same opportunities as someone who's born with a low IQ and is going to be ugly?
No.
All right, what would you have to do to give them the equality of opportunity?
Extreme makeover.
Okay, extreme makeover. Okay.
You have to lower the levels.
Or eugenics. You know, if you could determine at birth, if we had genetic engineering carried sufficiently to a high enough level, then everyone could have the same gene pool, be brought up in the same arrangement, platonic orphanages. Every child would be treated exactly the same. That would be the requirement for really strict equality of opportunity. But is that something we want? I mean, that's ridiculous. The key thing is that people be free to do the best they can with the opportunities that confront them and to improve their abilities, and then they'll widen the opportunities open to them. So if you're interested in further discussion along these lines, I have a discussion in, I guess, Chapter 9, Part B somewhere, which is not on the reading list, but you might find it of interest. And one of the things that goes into is how a child of poor, ignorant parents could conceivably surpass the child of very wealthy, successful parents. It depends on what they've done with their lives. They've had 2 infants in the crib. One of them is not in a position to call up his father's stockbroker and tell him what profitable investments to make. And then you can see by the time they're 6 or 7, maybe one child is eager to acquire knowledge. He's curious. He has questions. He's eager to find answers. The other one doesn't particularly care. Well, they're developing their means of acquiring further knowledge. Now, maybe by the time they're 14, one of them has studied science. He's learned some elementary physics, mathematics,